California, stay away from here. Stay away from here now. Don't come in here. Whatever you hear, stay away. John Doe has the upper hand.
I saw you with the box. What was in the box?
Koji.
Oh, what's in the box?
Koji.
What's in the box?
He just told you.
You lied!
Koji.
Oh, God! Oh, God! Oh!
Mold brain.
That means it's time for another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here with a man that has a strange box in his basement with wires and sensors coming out of it and little screens and lights beeping and booping. Also known as Anthony Maddox. What are you up to over there, Anthony?
Well, it's my life support system for some mold I'm growing.
It's an incubator for mold.
Exactly. I'm really excited about my mold incubator. Thank
Me
you
too.
so much for all of your help.
I did so little.
You did a lot.
Just drilled a hole in the side of it and ripped a compressor out of it.
Yeah, but it's so important that everybody brings their own unique skills to a project like this. You're really good at ripping stuff out of an old refrigerator.
Okay.
I'm really good at reading
all the
lot.
other stuff. Doing anything productive and creative instead of just purely destructive.
Anyway, I'm growing koji, which is the base for so much food in Asian cuisines, and it's strangely sort of like not really a thing that's known here, but it's the start for making sake and soy sauce and miso and Korean jungs and all these sort of different fermented pastes.
And it grows on the rice?
It grows on the rice,
or the rice
on
becomes
other grains. That is a good... Figuring out kind of the language to use has definitely been a little bit difficult because I think both the mold is called koji, but then also the product that is the mold growing on the rice is also called koji.
And do people just eat that? Is that a thing you could eat?
You can. If you're Rene Redzepi, you're gonna go to town on that. But
well, he eats all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely gonna try it, but generally no. It's just a component in a process that you're gonna end up somewhere else. I've just been, having a lot of fun learning to make stuff from scratch and reading a couple books that kind of suggested, like, hey, this is a thing you could do. And then a couple months ago, I was like, no, this is a thing I can do. We should definitely just do this. I don't know how much the U.S. is going to be connected to other countries in a couple of years. So maybe being able to make my own soy sauce is actually pretty important.
Yeah. How long is it going to take to get the koji product from, how long at this stage? How long is your mold going to be in the mold NICU?
2 days.
Oh, that's so much less long than I thought.
It's not that long.
Okay, well, that's good. You get a quick feedback loop. If it doesn't turn out the way you want, you just do it again 2 days later.
I've just wasted a bunch of rice and my spores.
No, not wasted.
You're right.
Think of how much you learned.
Utilized them for learning.
Think of how much you learned.
We'll see. It's a little bit of a scary fermentation. I've also been doing some pickling and other kinds of fermentation projects, and those are all honestly much easier and more understandable.
Well, they didn't involve a special box.
They didn't involve a special box. You just salt your vegetables and you're kind of creating the environment where only the kind of microbes that you want can survive. So it's what's really going to go wrong? Maybe it's not going to be perfect. Maybe it's not going to be exactly as delicious as you want.
You're not going to grow some sort of new hostile mold in the salt water.
Exactly. And that's the challenge with growing koji is it requires very specific conditions, and those conditions are extremely hospitable to all kinds of things. So instead of using sort of environmental control to grow the right things you're trying to grow, instead you're relying on sanitation and careful physical separation and
stuff,
starting with a culture and inoculating things very carefully. And once it sort of starts growing and establishing itself, then you're in a pretty good spot
because it'll box out other things,
right? Yeah, but that's why you need this very specific chamber and this very particular process, and we'll see. By the time that this episode comes out, we'll know if I have succeeded in my first koji fermentation.
Maybe even your second or third by the time this episode comes out.
It's possible.
And then, doesn't it take a super long time to make soy sauce from that koji then?
Yeah.
I know the Mala Market soy sauce is served for 360 days. That's a long time.
It does take a long time. So actually with soy sauce, you're really encouraging me here, and I could talk about this for more than an episode.
People love this. We have timestamps linked in the show notes if you don't want to listen to more mold talk.
So soy sauce starts a little bit differently, where you're actually growing the koji on soybeans. What I'm doing is I'm starting just a rice ferment, which is going to give me a bunch of koji, which the main thing that koji does is it creates a bunch of enzymes that then break down other stuff. So you can take that and mix it with soybeans, and it'll break down all the proteins in the soybeans into component amino acids that are extremely flavorful. So that's how you'd make miso and why miso is delicious.
And very flavor dense.
And that part of the process takes a really long time. So I'll take this koji, I'll mix it with some cooked soybeans or potentially some other sources of protein, and then let that ferment at closer to room temperature for a long time.
That doesn't go back in the box?
Does not need to go back in the box. It is temperature sensitive, so...
you don't want to put it on your windowsill or whatever.
Or maybe you do. If you raise the temperature, the fermentation at that point, which it's more of like an enzymatic process at that point. You don't have quite as much actual microbial activity, but it will still go faster at warmer temperatures. But, sitting in my basement, it'll take a couple months, depending on exactly what we're going for.
I see. So what else goes in the box? You make koji in the box. What else do you make in the box?
So the other thing that goes in the box is really hot ferments. I'm excited to try this thing from, speaking of Rene Redzepi, from a book coming from his restaurant, The Noma Guide to Fermentation, which, thank you to somebody on the Scryfall Food Discord channel for pointing this book out to me, because I read the whole thing in like a week and it was amazing.
I'm a little surprised that Rene Redzepi is like a food guide that you like. He seems like he could be one of the ones that you would really dislike.
He's an interesting guy. I'm appreciating reading both that book. And to be honest, it's written by David Silber. It's mostly not Rene Redzepi specifically. But, it's a different perspective, and I'm also reading some of Sandor Katz's books, and getting those different perspectives is helpful. The other thing that involves the hot box from that book is what he's calling garum. Basically, it's just like fish sauce, but starting with other proteins. So,
yes, this is the fermented beef you've been talking about.
Exactly. So we're going to take that koji, we're going to mix it with some beef, and we're going to leave it at 140 degrees Fahrenheit for a couple months. And
that's just sous vide.
Allegedly, something delicious is going to come out of it, but
really, 140 for that long?
Yeah. I mean, again, like it's all about the enzymatic
like
process, and all of that's going to happen much faster at higher temperatures, and I'm not worried about poisoning myself at that temperature either, so that's the other purpose of the box.
That's crazy. That's a really high temperature, way higher than I would have expected. That really feels like cooking to me. Like, is it not going to just completely turn to mush?
No, it is. Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's what you want.
It's turning to mush. You are correct.
You want it to be mush at the end.
And then you strain it off, and you get a liquid. It is like fish sauce. And then the last thing that we can do in there is make black garlic, or black anything at all you want.
You just put a little black and a little garlic in there and it just works?
Yeah, you just take a Sharpie and you just... No, you just put it in at high temperature, again, like 140 for a couple months.
That's crazy.
I'm really excited about this whole fermentation situation.
I'm excited about it too, and I get to eat some of the results, and some of the products.
Some of these products are starting to get pretty good. I'm really happy with the last batch of kimchi that I made. I've been eating kimchi like every day. I don't know if this is good for me, but
I think it is.
Here we are. Great.
Thus concludes Pickle Corner. Love to put a pickle in a corner. Anthony, did you know this is our 250th episode of Lucky Paper Radio?
That's crazy.
Yeah, I was actually off by one because of I got confused a little bit. 250th canon episode of Lucky Paper Radio. There's obviously a bunch of bonus episodes. So yeah, we're like 10 weeks out from having to be doing this for 5 years, which is crazy.
5 years. Yeah, I was talking with somebody on social media somewhere and was like, oh yeah, we've been doing this podcast, and I went to like go count and like see how long we've been doing. 4.5 years. I like double checked a couple times because I was like, is this really what we've been doing?
Yeah, I remember us talking about if we were going to run out of episode topics in like the first couple months.
And we did.
Was the answer. No, we just talk about pickles for 9 minutes.
Just talk about
it's
pickles.
Fine. That solves all the problems. No, I actually have a topic I've been really interested to talk about on this episode, so we got to get into it, which is this pattern I've noticed in cube design that I feel like is a kind of game design concern. Like, I think a lot of cube design things are just kind of borrowed from like deck design, right? We've talked about this before, that there's a huge, long history in Magic of players designing their own decks, right? Building their own decks to try and meet some meta, playing in some constructed format, or even to express themselves in Commander or something. And so I think a lot of cube designers naturally are already deck builders, and so they tend to build cubes like they build decks, which is to say, if you're looking to try and support an archetype, or, figure out how many lands you should run in your cube, like those things are pretty helpful. Like all the things we learn from deck building can really inform that. Like, how many things do you need that support this theme for this theme to be felt? I think that's a thing you could learn from deck building and, port over to cube design pretty easily.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes I try to sort of put a strong wedge in between those two things, the sort of like designer perspective of designing a game and the player perspective of trying to solve that game. But I think you're right that you still can do effective cube design relying heavily on that kind of player perspective if you just sort of frame it as like a cube is kind of like shuffling eight decks together, and then figuring out a way to separate them back out. So if you want 8 decks that play a certain way, you can design them from a player perspective, shuffle them all together, and you'll get an experience that works pretty well. And like you're saying, sort of like, what is the kind of ratio of mana fixing to other effects do I want?
What does your curve look like? Those kind of questions.
What's the curve? What's the distribution between removal and threats? These kinds of things. If you're thinking about them from a player perspective, and then you put them into the cube in that format, you're going to get back out very much what you expect and what you intend.
Yeah, you're going to do. I think it's going to do a pretty good job of creating the kind of environment that you expect and would want to play. So there's a lot you can learn from that. There are limitations, though, and I think this is one of the, brightest examples of a thing that if you follow this sort of player perspective, you will maybe run afoul of this problem, which is you have something in your cube that is maybe a little dominant, or maybe a play pattern you don't like, something you consider a problem by whatever your definition of your cube is, right? So it could be that it's too powerful, it could be that it's leading types of games you don't like, but you've got a problem, and you want to fix it. And so what you do is you say, all right, here's my problem. I'm going to go find cards that will stop this from happening, that are answers to this problem. And then you draft the cube for a few more times, and you find that actually people are now just playing the problem cards right alongside the solution cards you added. And they've just put them together and said, actually, I'll just play both of these great cards. And the cards you added, ostensibly with the goal of stopping the problem or slowing the problem, addressing it in some way, just failed to do that job at all.
So, like, to give a really concrete example, do you mean something like Ragavan and similar, like, really efficient aggressive threats are kind of running over the table, so you want to try and add more removal to deal with them, so let's just, break Singleton and put a whole bunch of lightning bolts in so we can deal with all these cheap, efficient creatures, and then the same player that was taking all those cheap, efficient creatures now just also has a whole bunch more lightning bolts and actually uses them to make those threats even more potent. Is that kind of like a concrete example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think Ragavan is a great example. It's actually one of the ones in my notes, because specifically with Ragavan, I think what you often want in your cube is a lot of 1 mana removal spells, because if your opponent plays Ragavan on the play, you're only going to have 1 mana in play in that window for you to answer Ragavan before it starts snowballing out of control. And so you want to add anything at 1 mana that can deal with Ragavan. You know what those spells are also great at? Is clearing the way for Ragavan. So whatever you put in, whether it's lightning bolts or something way less powerful, it doesn't have to be like a premier option, it doesn't even have to be in red, but whatever you put in to help deal with Ragavan is also naturally going to allow the Ragavan player to clear blockers and still hit you with Ragavan on their turn 2, by definition. So I think it's a really good concrete example, and I think there's just tons of these throughout Magic, right? I have a couple from my cubes I want to talk about, and then I want to ask you if you have any from your own cube design experience that you can reference. This topic came about because of specifically some changes I was making to 100 Ornithopters. We've talked a little bit on this show about how there is a very creature light or sometimes creature-less control deck that do you want to give a little bit of a summary of what that cube is all about? I think the name explains it. It's my cube where there's 100 Ornithopters and no other creatures.
No other creatures. I think you need that second sentence to fully explain it.
Yeah, I guess they did see somebody made a clone of it this week for Arena, and they were like, I cloned it for Arena, what do you think? And they added a fair number of cards to make creature tokens, and I'm like, I think maybe that kind of misses the point.
Maybe the 100 Ornithopters don't matter as much when you do that?
Yeah, I don't know. Either way, there's 100 Ornithopters. Those are the only creatures you can ever have in play in this cube. There is no way to make a non-Ornithopter creature, so everything has to revolve around them, and all of your win conditions, all of your ways to deal damage to your opponent, make them lose life, all have to do with Ornithopters. There is a creature light, or sometimes, on rare occasion, creature-free control deck that can rear its ugly head. I say ugly head because I just said I want all the things in this cube to be about Ornithopters, and to a degree I think it's interesting where the control decks have to be designed so that all of its answers are tuned to that meta, but I still would prefer my control decks to be using Ornithopters to win the game, to be using Ornithopters to fuel their card draw engines, that kind of stuff. And so I was looking into ways to potentially make that deck worse. And one of the first things I thought was just, well, I should just cut down on the Disenchants, because the Disenchants are what this deck largely relies on. The 100 Ornithopters cube has this sort of emergent trait that if you can remove all the artifacts and enchantments that are buffing your opponent's Ornithopters, you've also kind of effectively removed the Ornithopters. So your Disenchant could also basically be a board wipe, and also a board wipe that makes half their future draws way worse, because now they're drawing another card that does nothing. So my first thought was cut down Disenchants, and what I ran up against is that this particular control deck also employs a lot of artifacts and enchantments that you really need to be able to answer. So the idea of cutting back the Disenchants is just going to make Aura Shards, Bow of Nylea, or Viridian Revel much better. Now, Aura Shards is maybe not the best example, because that one you specifically do want to have a lot of Ornithopters in your deck, which is one of the reasons I still like it, despite it being a power outlier. But cutting down on the amount of removal so those control decks have less tools available to them is also going to cut down on the removal so that your opponent's of those control decks have fewer ways to answer their key engine pieces.
Interesting. So this kind of like paradox can both happen in the additive sense of like, oh, I'm adding more cards to deal with this problem, but they also can synergize with that problematic play pattern. But it can also happen if you're removing answers to try and make something less viable. But it turns out that then that deck can potentially leverage those other tools more effectively because they know they're not as vulnerable.
Yeah, it's a game design question where every change you make is not affecting the one deck you're thinking of, it's affecting of the entire meta. And I think it's very hard for players, especially players that have really sort of ported over a lot of that deck building design knowledge to cube design, to put themselves in that mind space of being like, I'm making this change, I'm thinking about it as a way to nerf this deck. And they don't think about the impact that change is going to have on every other deck in the entire environment, and sort of knock-on changes of like, okay, now that those decks have changed in that way, what other decisions are your players going to make differently that are going to result in new sort of challenges that you didn't even predict from that sort of cascade of changes?
Yeah, I think that really does highlight sort of where that limitation of just thinking about cube design from a player perspective really does kind of start to become less useful or less all-encompassing. And I think that a cube like under the Ornithopters, which is so unusual, obviously in its structure and its gameplay, but also just in the metagame, is something that's so unfamiliar that no player is going to have that knowledge to be able to leverage. Right. Like, you need to have this holistic ability to think about it as a new system and be able to think through it from baser principles than just which cards do I think will be good and make the decks that I have in mind good.
Yeah, I think it is much harder to design a much more radical or novel cube with that sort of player's toolkit. I think you do need to be able to think more holistically, like you said. The other sort of very bright example I can mention here is a little bit tangential, but I think it's really worth talking about, which is from my Degenerate Microcube, which is a cube I've not worked on really actively for years. It is a cube where there are a number of rules modifications. You draft smaller packs. I think 2x12 is my current scheme. It started out as 2x10, and I've slowly made the pack size a little bigger over the years. And then you build a deck of 15 cards, so a much, much, much smaller deck. And you can't lose to drawing from an empty library. That's a sort of comprehensive set of rules changes. So now you start with half your deck in your opening hand, which makes it very easy to find a particular card or a combination of cards you want to play. And if you get to the point that your library is empty, you don't lose, you keep playing, but obviously you're not drawing a card every turn, so that's a significant downside. So you probably want to think about some way to recycle cards, reuse them from your graveyard, and it becomes this very interesting sort of puzzle where the matches are all about not tempo or card advantage, but just purely about what cards in your deck do I have to answer, and in what sequence, and what cards in my deck are you trying to answer, and in what sequence, and how can I draft and play in a way that makes my deck sort of better in this puzzle than yours. It makes a very card-focused sort of environment. Yeah, it's a funny sort of twist. I've definitely heard some limited formats described in this way, where it is not about tempo, it's just about if we both flip over our decks and, match up removal spell to threat, spell to threat, we can just figure out who wins. And, which usually describes very, very grindy limited formats, right? And that's always like an extreme kind of like, you're kind of saying a format feels more like that, but obviously game to game, like it's still, there's a lot of variance in the game. In this cube, it really feels concretely like that is the case. It is that, and it's not just sort of like on an abstract level. It's like literally this card to that card, not this kind of card to that kind of card. It's Emrakul to unsummon. Yeah. That's like I must unsummon your Emrakul, otherwise I lose this match no matter what. So your Merit Lage or whatever, and then the fact that there are all those little details of like unsummon works here, but Path to Exile doesn't because it has protection from something, and to me, that's an environment that, because it relies so much on those individual card interactions, it can be really difficult for me to get my head around when I'm so used to trying to think about Magic in this kind of more like statistical sense. Yeah. So for the purposes of this story, the card in question that was the problem is Ensnaring Bridge. And the problem was not that Ensnaring Bridge was too good. The problem was that it was annoying. Well, no, I mean, that's fine. There's a lot of annoying cards in this cube. This cube leans into annoying the heck out of you because the games are very short. So if you get really annoyed, just shuffle up, go on to the next one. But the problem with Ensnaring Bridge was that I have removed a stipulation that you lose to drawing from an empty library, which means that draws are now much more likely than they are in a typical game of Magic, because you can just get to a state where neither player can kill the other, and then the game just ends in a draw. I actually had very few problems with this until I added Ensnaring Bridge, and the play pattern I wanted to avoid specifically was people playing Ensnaring Bridge not in an Ensnaring Bridge deck, not because they had, Walking Ballista or Bomberman combo or like some other way to just kill their opponent without attacking in a long game. That I'm fine with. That's why I include the card in the cube. I think it's cool for that reason. What I didn't want was players just bringing in Ensnaring Bridge in whatever deck to force a draw if they thought they were going to lose. And then just have this...
So if you're saying like, oh, I'm going to win half of my games, but the ones that I feel like I'm about to lose, I'll just play the Ensnaring Bridge.
Yep.
And then instead of winning half the time, losing half the time, I'm winning half the time, drawing half the time,
Yep.
which means you're just winning.
Yep, that is the play pattern I wanted to discourage, and that a couple players did try and pull off. And so I was a much younger cube designer at the time, much fresher, much greener under the collar. What do they say? What's a greener under the what? It's just another instance of me inventing a whole... No,
Don't do it.
It's definitely something.
You
whatever
were
it is.
young.
I was much newer to cube design, and this cube already had some modified rules, so I said, I see a pretty obvious solution to this. I'll simply say, if the game ends in a draw, and you have Ensnaring Bridge in your deck, you have lost. Easy, right?
Easy. It's a lot to make one card functional or acceptable in a cube.
It feels dumb to have to say that at the beginning of the draft. That to me seemed like the biggest downside. Like now I'll have to there's another rules modification. I'll have to say it at the beginning of the draft. But I was willing to accept that to fix this problem. I thought this would fix the issue and the issue would go away. What actually happened? This rule was in play for exactly one draft. And what happened in this draft is there was a player that drafted an Ensnaring Bridge deck, and it was exactly the kind of deck I want people to play Ensnaring Bridge in. It had some combos, had ways to deal damage without attacking. It was like a kind of prison deck. Exactly what I want the card to be played in. And as soon as their opponent saw it across the table, they sideboarded their deck into trying to force a draw.
Cool.
Yep. They were just like, nope, I'm just going to try and force a draw now.
Now I know that if we draw, you now lose.
You lose now. So, and you can't side this card out realistically because it's an important part of
your entire 15 card deck around it.
Well, it plays a very specific role that almost no other cards play. That's part of why I love it in that cube, because it is so unique. And so you can't really afford, you don't have other answers to creatures in your deck. You're relying on this to not die to my creatures. And then if you play this, I just have sideboarded my deck into a way where I'm going to have way more answers, very few threats, and then just force a draw. And they succeeded in doing this. And I was like, well, nice job for me to try and solve that problem and actually just make the problem worse and more complicated immediately out of the gate. This is a little different, but I think it speaks to this idea of just hyper-focusing on a problem, thinking of a solution to it, and then there being a bunch of knock-on effects you did not anticipate. And the lesson I learned from this, honestly, was just that Magic's rules engine is great, and I have not made...
Don't mess with it. What are you thinking?
I have not made a rules modified cube since the Degenerate Microcube. I think that cube has a lot of really interesting aspects to it, but it's a huge downside that the rules are modified in any way. It makes it so much more intimidating to new players. It leads to things like this that, problems that Magic fixed 25 years ago that I have essentially unearthed from the dead by changing some of their rules, having the sort of the hubris to think that I could adjust things and make the game better or more suit my goals. And so it's one of the reasons that I will very rarely sort of make suggestions to people for what they should or shouldn't do in their cube. But I think if you're new to cube design and you're trying to build a play group, I always say that I really would strongly discourage rules modifications until you really have your feet under you and think you are confident in it, because this is the kind of stuff that can happen. So
it's unfortunate because I totally agree with you, and also I think they are very useful examples to talk about some of these topics because they are so extreme.
Oh, it's great for, if your goal is to learn a bunch of things about cube design so you can later do a podcast about it, then by all means, go make all the rules modified cubes you can possibly dream up, because you will learn a lot from it.
But I hope you have a tolerant play group.
Yeah, hope your friends like you a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an interesting example because, like we were talking about before, I've thought about this mostly in terms of card choices and just, are these cards working in the same deck together in ways that you didn't necessarily intend to? But it absolutely does apply to these bigger, more systemic changes in the rules engine itself. And that's so funny the way you, tried to put a patch on this issue and then...
I literally put a patch on and 2 leaks sprung on either side of the patch. And I was like, maybe 2 more patches and then 4 leaks.
I mean, okay, so is part of this discussion how do we fix these kinds of problems or how do we avoid these kinds? Because it seems like the first is just cut the problem entirely and stop trying to just, keep putting patches on it.
That is definitely a solution. I do have in my notes that we can get to ways to address this. But first, I'm curious to know what in your experience in your own cube design has, if anything, sort of felt like this to you, where you had a problem you were trying to fix, you were fixated on it, trying to fix that problem, and the solution you imposed actually ended up causing more problems or not even fixing the original problem in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had this issue in my regular cube a couple times in much less extreme ways, so it's maybe a little bit harder to see.
Yeah, in a very regular way.
In a very regular way.
Just like right in the middle.
This cube plays a lot more just like a limited set. It's just like, hey, you got a bunch of reasonably efficient 2 and 3 drop creatures and some pretty efficient removal. And I think some of the issues I'm still sort of like trying to, or maybe I'm more just content with the way that they are slightly flawed. But I mean, I think we could talk about the red aggressive decks have historically just been pretty dominant in that format. And I want to put in more removal to deal with them. And we could obviously talk about like the color pie is one of the biggest like obvious solutions to how do you encourage diversity in the game of Magic. Having multiple strategies that can sort of live side by side, like the color pie is just the most explicit manifestation of that. But even within a cube metagame, then it's like, okay, well, I added some more cheap, efficient removal to green. I added, Tail Swipe and a couple other 1-mana fight spells. And then red happens to pair pretty well with green now. And then maybe I add a couple more cheap ones, add some more Disfigures in black, add some other cheap ways to deal with those really efficient threats. And then turns out red also can pair pretty well with black. And like you were talking about with Ragavan, use those efficient removal spells in order to clear blockers and actually just make those threats even more impactful. Another sort of similar aspect to this is flying is really, really powerful in that cube because just having reach, having ways to like force through the last bit of damage. Yeah, reach not in the sense of the keyword, but reach in the sense of, you had an aggressive start, but then your opponent finally starts to get their feet under them, get some creatures in play, some ways to block, and you need ways to deal those last 5-6 points of damage. One way to deal with that is adding more flyers, but then if there's more flyers, there's more games that are being lost to creatures with flying when there's an imbalance. So maybe the answer just is reach. Like, that's why I think reach, the keyword, exists, because it is this third piece to the puzzle that kind of makes games potentially a little bit more dynamic, while it is a piece of interaction that doesn't also create the same problem of just, like, ending games in that way.
Yeah, you're not like, hooray, I get to jam my reach creatures alongside my flying creatures. Although, that allows you to block their flyers and let your flyers attack constantly, which could be something.
That's true. And I think that where I landed on that is just like Menace is my favorite keyword. It's just the best combat focused keyword, and everybody knows that.
Did you rate it higher than flying on our vanilla keywords tier list episode?
I think they might have been in the same very high tier.
They were definitely both very high tier for both of us. Yeah.
Menace is great. I mean, speaking of the color pie, I feel like another cube that has been, years and years defunct at this point, but I had a mono black cube briefly, where the goal of the cube was just kind of to ask the question, can Magic still be fun without the color pie? Mm-hmm. And one way we could do that is just to play only one color, so it's like, effectively, there's
now
a
black mana symbol and a colorless mana symbol are basically
almost the same. And I think that was really the most difficult thing to balance here. Like, yes, I think the answer to that question was, yeah, there were still, like, interesting games. And after the draft, you were just playing a black-on-black mirror match, but it was still fun games, and it felt like Magic. But all of those questions about, like, oh, do I want the most efficient threats or do I want the most efficient removal? It's like there's nothing really forcing me from making that choice. I'm just going to take the best card between those two in any case.
And as a designer, you had almost no knob. You couldn't even, like, introduce something that's good against some other black cards. You know every single player can put it in their deck regardless of what they're doing. Like,
exactly, yeah.
The one axis I think you kind of had access to was just mana value, just assuming that, okay, aggressive decks are going to want cheap things and slower decks are going to want more expensive things. So are there expensive cards that are good against the aggressive decks that will somehow help, even though you can't cast them till you're probably almost dead anyway? But you kind of limited yourself really to that one axis of, like, deck diversity. Was, are you a low curving deck or a high curving deck? I mean, there's certainly, like, synergies and archetypes within there, but there's nothing stopping somebody from playing X synergistic package alongside all the answers to that synergistic package when you have no color pie.
So I do think that is the other answer, and where I sort of left that cube was, I see that I could push this further, but it's not what's currently catching my interest. But I do think that sort of synergy question is the other big answer, to say that there's some deck that cares about +1/+1 counters, and there's some deck that cares about zombies, and some deck that cares about enchantments, whatever other things you can find in just mono black. Is the answer when your drafting decisions end up being about, do I want this generically powerful threat or generically powerful answer, or do I actually want this component that's going to be extremely powerful and is going to be even better than those other more generic options in my specific deck that I'm drafting? And I think that is ultimately the answer to this question in a lot of contexts, but it both takes a lot of work to make that what is objectively true, that those cards that are more narrow end up being the objectively correct choice. And then it also takes a degree of sort of signaling of having those cards look appealing and make sense and be visible to your players. So not only is it the right thing, but it is the thing that your players are being drawn to do.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have any other examples from your cubes, your own cubes?
The last one that really stands out, and I think the sort of solution to this is not about changing the cube, but sort of changing expectations, which I think is a really interesting topic we could go into. But in the Turbo Cube, which is, we're just going through all the weird cubes because I think they do really express some of these situations. But my Turbo Cube is perfectly normal magic, except all spells and activated abilities cost 2 generic mana less. So everything is busted and you're doing all kinds of crazy storm stuff. And that was kind of the problem. There was just maybe a little too much of the crazy storm stuff, and it's kind of fun to draft it the first time and be able to combo off on turn one. As it sort of turned into a cube that we actually draft every couple months in the play group, that loses some of its luster. And we wanted the gameplay to be a little bit more dynamic and interactive. And finding ways to counter some of those really powerful strategies without also just supporting them more is difficult. I think counter spells, we're just going to have all the keyword confusion in this part of the discussion. Counter spells are a great example where it's like, well, if I can counter your combo piece on turn one, then we're actually going to have a little bit more of a dynamic gameplay because you also have to have a plan B and like figure out how to kill me now that I've countered your Aetherflux Reservoir that you thought was your turn one win condition. Turns out, Force of Will, also very good in the combo deck where you're trying to do that and want to protect your Aetherflux Reservoir. And similarly, playing cards that are like Hate Bears that increase the cost or prevent you from casting things for free. Turns out that those are not just good against those kinds of decks. They are really, really good in those decks when you're especially on the play. And you get to dump your whole hand, do something very powerful, and then end on one of these cards that
Void
just
Mirror.
sort of shuts the door on your opponent. Yeah, Void Mirror is sort of like the perfect example.
Because that one's free. I mean, I think like Archon of Mirror is even better, but you got to save a white mana if you want to end your turn that way, whereas Void Mirror just says you can use all your resources to do all the unfair stuff you want, then just simply place me on the table at the end, and I will make your opponent's life much harder.
Right, and I think that sort of the answer there has been kind of a metagame shift where people kind of just know that that's how some of the gameplay is, and that we do have these cards that operate on a more fair axis, Disenchant, Lightning Bolt, things that can kill your Void Mirror and your Archon of Emeria, and know that you need some amount of those in your deck. And
just to be clear, you're referring to those as their archetypes. You don't play Lightning Bolt and Disenchant in this cube. You have various 3-mana things.
It's a 3-mana spell that looks like a Lightning Bolt, but it also proliferates or does a little extra. But yeah, having those kinds of like fair-looking cards turns out to be really important because when your opponent dumps their hand, ends on Void Mirror, you need to answer with, here's a basic land, or here's a dual land, and here's my topple the statue, and then I'll be able to go off in turn.
Yeah, I would say that to me, there are very few things that feel like distinct archetypes in the Turbo Cube. It feels like it kind of mirrors a lot of your similar texture of design in like the regular cube, where you don't have like a bunch of cards that are all committed to one deck. You have like little tiny packages where it's like, there's a little bit of thing that cares about discard, so if you can then make your opponent discard some cards or play some wheels, you'll get benefits from it. There's a little thing that cares about tokens, so if you can make a Jade Mage and make a bunch of tokens, you can possibly benefit from it. There's a few things that care about landfall, so if you can play extra lands, you can go off. Yeah,
I think Fast Bond is probably the most kind of insular strategy, but other than that, I think you're right.
About the discard deck, but either way,
or discard, But
either way, I think it's like you are never drafting just that deck. You are always combining, call it 3 to 5 like little packages to make a new thing. And so in terms of expectation setting, like this whole paradox is about like a problem you're trying to solve. And what's the problem here? Just that sometimes decks are too good. And so that's a really, really broad problem.
Cube is a creative pursuit, so it's not like there is some objective goal that all of us are on the same page about pursuing. It's about creating a fun time ultimately. Like that's maybe the one objective thing we could say, but yeah, it is about sort of setting your own goals, and then you have a benchmark to judge your success on. And I think specifically that sort of like shift in context of this is a cube we're going to play once or twice and haha, what a lark.
There's a lot of people I think that would be happy to play that cube every other week, just so you know.
Well,
It's not
and
you.
I think that we have, like, I've made changes to the cube in order to make it more replayable. Like, that shift in thinking about it from a one-time special treat to this is a thing that I want to be playable multiple times meant that I was thinking about it in those terms of how do we create more interactive gameplay so you can walk away from a draft and feel a little bit more rewarded and feel like you had more agency, was a shift in my thinking about the cube. And yeah, some potential future changes once my mold brain clears up and I think more about magic.
I don't want the mold brain to clear up at all. I want you to keep focusing on fermentation,
Keep
brother.
focusing on that fermentation. But yeah, I have some future... I have a big list of maybes that I'm going to revisit this cube with, and I think I'm going to try and push it even more in that direction of how do we scale back some of those types of games and create even more interactive gameplay.
Because you still haven't made any of the changes from the whole episode we recorded with Julian about this, right?
No, they're just sort of fermenting now. That was like the
They're in the box.
That
They're
was
in
the
the hot
koji
box.
fermentation phase where we had a lot of rapid growth of this starter material.
I see.
And now it's
You are so
marinating,
fermentation
it's
pill, brother.
salted, it's curing in the back of my brain. And we're just gonna crack it open in a couple weeks and taste the tamari on top and see if it's good.
And add Shoulder of the Apocalypse.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a little bit of a tangent, but I think the problem you described with the Turbo Cube is also a great example of what can happen over time if you just continue to update your cube the way you would update a deck, which I would say the earliest days of a Turbo Cube, I don't think it was quite so dominant. It was just that whenever new sets came out, of course, the things that you and everyone else wanted to add to the cube were more of the really powerful stuff that is like really interesting and novel and newly broken by this restriction. And you cut some cards people weren't playing that were, kind of, duds. And so over time, the whole cube just gets better and better and better in a way that means that not that the games are better, but that each individual deck is now better, and that means that actually the games are maybe worse because the decks that can win on turn one are doing it more consistently, and the answers are less effective than they once were. And so I think it's important to like have an attitude towards like long-term growth and maintenance of a cube that sort of takes this broad perspective into mind rather than just when you're solving a specific problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another case where we really see the difference in the player... I like the way you phrase it. Like the player toolkit approach to building a cube is
cut bad cards. Add
also,
good cards.
going to lean towards just, and this is why I sort of started using the word power motivated, because people got very hung up on power max, and I was like, okay, well, but if I show you Shock and Lightning Bolt, you're going to say Lightning Bolt is a better card, and that's the reason you're putting in your cube. Like your primary motivation given two options is play the most powerful option, and I think that like you're saying, in this specific cube, really has created some of those issues and sort of like led to this evolution in the kind of gameplay that exists here, and needs some more systematic think about the whole thing rather than just think about here's a new set, let's put in all the most broken cards.
Yeah. Before we get to like potential ways to address this paradox, I think there's a little bit more constructive precedent I want to reference. I surely heard this on the Eternal Glory podcast because that's the place I hear most of my Legacy content these days. But for those that don't know, and I'm not an expert of the Legacy metagame, so forgive me, Legacy Spikes, if I get any of this a little wrong. But for a long time, the de facto best deck in Legacy has been Delver, right? The Delver deck. Especially pre-Fire Design era, but I think even still to this day, a lot of people would argue that that's kind of like the main deck in Legacy that you have to like keep in mind when you're deck building and like building your sideboard. How are you going to beat the Delver deck?
I'm worried about statements like that. I don't know anything about Legacy, and
You can worry about it all you want. It's fine. If you get mad at me, it's fine. Leave Anthony out of it.
I don't know anything about Legacy.
Great, you're free. So a thing that people think about in Legacy a lot, if you're a Legacy player, is like, how do I beat the Delver deck? And oftentimes during spoiler season, new cards get printed, and players are like, here we go. Here's the new card that's going to make my deck viable in the face of Delver now, because this new powerful tool got added. And a pattern that has happened repeatedly, over and over again, for many, many years, is that players initially think, great, this is going to make my deck better than Delver. And then what actually happens is that card is at its best when it's played alongside Delver. It's the exact same problem we're describing in cube design, where it's like, I added this card to stop Ragavan or to stop this one power outlier. I added more interaction, more removal or whatever. And it turns out that what's really good is that alongside all the new interaction you printed. Tarmogoyf was kind of the original version of this that came along. People were like, yes, green is now the best deck in Legacy. We have this card that is much harder to answer. It's much stickier. It grows big really fast. Well, what if we just play Blue-Green Delver now? Like, that's actually quite good. Orcish Bowmasters is a really good recent example of a card that, on its face, seems great against all the blue Delver decks. Gonna mess up all their brainstorms. It can deal 1 damage to the Delver before it flips. All that stuff is great. It's also really good alongside Delver, it turns out. Ren and 6, Oko, all these cards kind of fit that definition of cards that, on its face, is like, here's a good reason to not play Delver. And then it turns out that actually you just put it into the best deck and it still shines the brightest. So this problem is not unique to us, certainly in Cube design. It's just that, again, the way you would solve that problem in Legacy is like, okay, it's best in Delver, great, play it in Delver. Solution. I found the solution to my problem, which is I want to play the best deck at the upcoming Legacy event. You are not trying to fix the Legacy metagame. Really, nobody's trying to fix the Legacy metagame, if we're honest. If anybody, it's Wizards, but I think it's probably not a huge focus of theirs. So we're in the position of like the people making the ban list, the people that are designing the cards when we're cube curating to try and make a meta where the kind of things you want to thrive. And if you consider Delver to be a problem, the way to answer it is probably not to add Tarmogoyf and Orcish Bowmasters, because now you just have Delver, Tarmogoyf, and Orcish Bowmasters.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that is a great point that even coming from a purely player perspective, the idea of like understanding the metagame is still something that players think about and applies to cube design in a way.
That one's most strongly sort of similar to your red being the best color in regular cube.
Right, yeah.
It's like, yeah, whatever you add, pair with all the good red cards, and then it is at its best. That is when that card is most effective.
But I think there's also something to this that I feel like that's saying like, oh, Delver's always the best in Legacy. If I'm thinking about that from a cube perspective, that doesn't necessarily seem like a bad thing either. Like, I know we're talking about there is a quote-unquote problem that this card is too powerful. It's also really nice and is a good way to sort of get your teeth into a new cube, to have an idea of what the boogeyman at the table is. Like, what is the thing that you really need to be able to beat? And sitting down and saying, like, yeah, I know that these red-green decks are really, really good in this environment, say in the regular cube, and if I'm not doing that, I need to know that my deck has the tools to beat them. So, like, I'm going to take, mass -2/-2 effects really highly because I know they're good against that deck. And yeah, I mean, having sort of those anchor points can be a really valuable tool. So absolutely. I don't think it's necessarily all bad.
No, for sure. And I think it's pretty clear, and I'm speculating here, but I think it's pretty clear from Wizards of the Coast perspective that they want blue to be one of, if not the best color in Legacy. Like, that is the format for playing Brainstorm and Daze and Wasteland. I mean, they basically said as much. I mean, the latest, like, sort of smaller scale problem deck in Legacy was Blue-Black Reanimator because of Psychic Frog that got Frog and also Troll of Khazad Doom banned. And they said it in that banned and restricted announcement, I'm 99% sure, that they consider banning Reanimate, which is seemingly most obviously the problem, because that is like a card that is singular in how effective it is, how efficient it is, its rate, and like, are they just going to start playing the non-black cycling creatures from that cycle in Lord of the Rings and just reanimating those instead? Like, Reanimate is consistently the problem, but they have said specifically that they want a format where people can play Reanimate. Like, Magic deserves a format where players can cast the spell Reanimate. Even if it is the problem, that is the sort of pillar of that format. And yeah, I think it's good that Brainstorm and Daze are playable in Legacy, and even if it would make the meta more balanced or whatever, I don't think it'd be a mistake to ban them, because that's what that format is about. That's the format's identity. And so I think a huge part of cube design is deciding what your format's identity is going to be. And that's one of the solutions I have here, is just accept it. Just be like, you know what? This thing I thought was a problem is actually not the problem. That's just what this is about. And that kind of comes back to your expectation setting of just how do you describe the cube. I don't think it's to the point in the regular cube where you should say, by the way, red's the best color. But
I've been saying that to people.
If they, unprompted or only if they ask?
If they ask. Although, yeah, I mean, some non-red decks have been doing well, and maybe part of that is just because the real meta solution is I tell everybody that red is the best color, and then red just gets split.
It's drafted by 5 players now, and now it's not so good.
Which is honestly one of the options that I put down. Do you think it's reasonable in some cases to either by literally just adding more cards to support a particular thing that feels problematic, or maybe just more cards that signal that to make it more visible, a particular strategy, so that it gets split by more drafters? Is that, do you think, ever a reasonable solution in a cube?
That is, I think it definitely is, and this is actually one of the cube design topics I have most wanted to investigate and talk about, that I feel like is hardest to wrap people's heads around, and hardest for me to wrap my own head around, which is that I think, let's just like simplify a cube for our purposes. Okay. To just like make a mental model of it. Let's just imagine
4 or 5 sides.
Let's just imagine that every single card in the entire cube just gets a number, and that number is its power level.
Impact on win percentage.
Impact on win percentage. And we're going to like have a certain distribution of, blue has, 4 10s and 3 8s and a bunch of 4s, and red has no 10s but a bunch of 9s or whatever. Just like distribute these in some way throughout the cube. I suspect that if you then had like bots draft that, and we've actually tried to simulate this in the past and haven't gotten far enough along that I feel confident in it, but if you then simulate drafts, I feel like there is probably some high correlation between like number of really obvious power outliers in specific colors and resulting decks that end up getting drafted. I mean, I think all cube designers have this, right? Like every cube has, I mean, endless number of decks in it, but like at the very least, you got all 10 2-color pairs, and that's not getting drafted every draft because you only have 8 players most of the time. You have all the different 3-color combinations. You have all the different sort of 2 colors with this color splash. There are so many decks in each cube, and I think a lot of us probably have the feeling of like, this deck gets drafted all the time, like every draft, no matter what, and this other deck that I think is here, that I think all the pieces are here for, just never happens. No one ever drafts it. The example I used to give of this ages ago was in the very brief period that Oko was in the Bun Magic cube. Before that, nobody would ever play blue-green. It was just like, people just didn't like blue-green in that cube. It wasn't an appealing color pair. As soon as Oko was there was a blue-green drafter every single draft without fail, no matter what. And Oko is a great card. It was probably too good for the cube, but in a lot of games, you don't draw Oko, and your deck is still good. That blue-green deck still functions. It's still a strong deck. It's just that it didn't have the signpost like Oko to draw people in. So to answer your question in a very roundabout way, absolutely. I don't know exactly what advice to give people for how to change that texture of where the power is distributed to change draft incentives. Partially because, obviously, if you and I sat down and just tried to subjectively make our, like, you know, power ranking from 1 to 10 for every card in a cube we both know well, we would disagree a lot. And part of drafting is that 8 players are drafting it all with their different sort of matrix in their head. So it's really hard to sort of understand this problem and get your head around it. But I think it's a huge factor in the resulting decks of a draft that we spend almost no time talking about because it's really hard to talk about.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely true, and I love adding this layer of nuance that it's not just about sort of the total volume of, let's say, a specific color, but about that distribution and the way that's going to affect people's perception during drafting. And, like, drafting matters here. It would be very different if we were just building sealed pools. And looking specifically at the red section, I've thought about a lot how I think a big component to why red is very powerful here is the floor on the cards is just very high. Like, every red spell is just a pretty efficient creature or a efficient burn spell. There are almost no cards that are like situational cards or cards that you might think of as a dud in this cube. Whereas in green, there definitely are. There's like, oh, here's this, or here's Future Sight. It's like, is that good? Well, kind of, if you can like set it up. It's a little bit more situational.
You said in green, you mean in blue?
Yeah, I switched over. You know, green and blue, they're similar.
Sure.
But then to think about green, like, I think you're absolutely right that there are more cards that are visibly splashy. It's like or maybe this is also just a little bit of my taste, but I see Earl of Squirrel, or I see, you know, especially a card like Saddled Rhymestag. It's just one of the cards that I think is one of the biggest power outliers in this cube that is going to draw me into green. And even though I had been thinking more about the high floor of the red cards, there's also not a super high ceiling. Like, the cards are all pretty narrow, and I think that means it gets sort of drafted somewhat appropriately. Whereas a player might see, and it's a mistake, but a player might see Earl of Squirrel and say, oh, I'm going to jump into green and I'm going to commit to this really, really hard.
No one does that.
Okay, what are the cards that really want to make you overcommit to a color in this kind of environment?
Tireless Tracker in there? Is that still in there?
No, that was never in here.
That was in there for a little bit at least, wasn't it?
I don't think so. Who can say? Courser of Crewfix?
That's a strong one for sure.
Yeah, and I think that both the outliers on both ends impact the way that the draft feels and impact the number of players that are going to fall into every color.
It's Andy from the editing booth, and I just wanted to make one sort of maybe subtext thing a little more clear here, because I think some of this discussion around how power outliers might change the distribution of players in different color combinations sounds very obvious and not at all revelatory, and the thing that is just under the surface here that I didn't exactly say is that I think because every card affects all of the decks at the table and not just the deck in question, one unintuitive side effect is that potentially a way to make a color worse is to add more power outliers to that color, such that in the draft it is much more likely to be split. Like, if you take red as the most powerful color in the cube right now, and you add 3 more power outliers and just 3 individual cards, like, how much of those 3 individual cards going to affect the win percentages of the decks they end up in? Probably fairly minimally, just by pure statistics. But if they consistently lead to more players playing those colors and splitting that full pool across additional drafters, they could, on average, make the color worse by putting more powerful cards in, which is definitely, I think, a compelling example of this paradox, though not one that I can prove right now. Just a thought that I have. Yeah, it's also not just purely about power outliers. So, Bones came to Baltimore, drafted 100 Ornithopters, and drafted a near creatureless deck. He still had 2 Ornithopters in his deck because he just didn't have enough playables, which I was proud of. I'm like, I don't want this deck to be easy to draft, and it was so not easy to draft that you played, I think, 18 or 19 lands and 2 Ornithopters because you were just like...
I guess this blocks sometimes.
Well, to be clear, he did have, he was using Heirloom Epic, which is a card draw engine that is way better when you have creatures, and he was just planning to spend 4 mana on every time. So he was like, well, at least now Heirloom Epic I can occasionally spend a little less mana on or whatever. He did also have a Vraska in his deck, so he's like, maybe I can somehow actually kill somebody with one of these 2 Ornithopters instead of just milling them out, which was his actual goal. When I sat down for that draft, I was like, I hope players take the Disenchants and don't let Bones have all of them. And this happens actually more often than it should, I think, in that cube, is people don't understand the value of a Disenchant. They don't understand how good it is to have 1 or 2 in your deck to answer the problematic things and completely change the sort of evaluation of the board state. And so they just think of them as sideboard cards or whatever. They take them lowly, but one player knows. Or, maybe 2 players know, but that other player is just doing like a dedicated combo thing and is like, I'll take 1 Disenchant if I can get it, but I really want all the cards in my deck to be focused on this strategy. And then what happens is the player that knows ends up getting this sort of secret deck. Right now, as I sit here, there's 12 cards that can remove an artifact and an enchantment in the 100 Ornithopters cube. There's a couple more that can remove just artifacts, so there's a few more things in that sort of space. But in terms of destroy target artifact or enchantment, there's 12 that can do it. Which means that each player should only have 1 and a half. But that is not what happens. And even if you have all 12, that's a lot. If you have all 12, you're doing really good.
That is a lot.
I think Bones had 6 of them in his deck when he came here and drafted. I can double check the deck list and maybe I'll add the number in post. The number is 8. And still made people feel like he had, all of them at the table, basically. So it's not just power outliers and pure distribution of power that comes into play here. It's, how players approach the table with their own sort of meta-knowledge of the environment. Bones sat down planning to draft this deck, forced it, basically, and was able to do it successfully because 6 of the players at the table, 5 of the players at the table just didn't know that they should not let Disenchant wheel to Bones or whatever.
I'm sort of imagining that kind of really bare bone structure that you were kind of describing of just let's just assign a win percentage level to every card and then kind of simulate how that would play out, and imagine drafters are just starting by picking the most powerful card and then eventually narrowing in on particular colors. And that's kind of the simulation I'm imagining in my mind.
That's exactly what I'm imagining too.
But I think you are right that players don't all function that way, and some players are going to do their research. I mean, I'll think about Zach Barish drafting the regular cube also is willing to do that homework and be like, oh, what are the things that are challenging here? Well, card advantage is hard to come by, and the white wraths are the most powerful way to get card advantage. Therefore, when I sit down, I'm planning to draft blue-white. And, things can change, but that is his baseline for drafting this cube. And same with Bones, he sat down and said, I think this is the most powerful strategy based on looking at the entire cube. Therefore, I am taking every disenchant and ignoring whatever signals I see during the draft. And that is not at all like our little simulation. So, it is much more complicated when this hits real players.
Yeah, and in the Bones example, he also gets to ignore some of the 10s or S tier cards because they just don't do anything in his deck.
Right.
He gets to ignore R shards, he gets to ignore Glimpse of Nature, he gets to ignore cards that other players are taking, and instead he's just taking cards that other players see as C pluses or Bs, and he's taking them as a premium and is able to, by combination of them, make a strategy that is much stronger than the combo decks are if the sort of situation is right.
Right. Which this is more of just observation because it's is that a problem that some players do that? No, of course not. It's it creates more interesting texture to a different group of players is going to have this totally different deck. But then we can also see how that fits into a metagame and think about, well, have they demonstrated the viability of a particular deck that now is going to become the boogeyman because everybody knows to look for it?
Well, I would love to sit 8 Boneses down and have them draft this cube and see what happens. I would love to just have 2 Boneses, just 2 people trying to force that deck. I think they both probably, if they're hard forcing, are going to have a really hard time. But who knows? That's never happened.
So, but maybe where we're landing is just that the cube is self-correcting, draft is self-correcting, so...
You can lean on that a lot, I think.
None of this really matters at all. Just put whatever cards you want in your cube and you're done.
I think that is one of the solutions. Just accept that every draft's going to be different. Cubes are generally self-correcting, draft is self-correcting, and just let it go, and it'll be fine and work out. I do think there are times where, as a cube designer, you should try and exert your designerly focus. And in this case, specifically, I think the control deck that Bones draft is very cool. I like it a lot. I want it to happen sometimes. I don't want it to happen very often. I think if it happens very often, then I am kind of subverting or not delivering on the promise that this cube is all about Ornithopters. Because it turns out you can just draft Bow of Nylea and a bunch of control cards and then just never die at a decking and stop all of your opponents who were trying to do what the cube is ostensibly about. Which, again, I think if you are being... And to be clear, like, his deck had a lot of really suboptimal cards. Like, he was playing Heirloom Epic with 2 creatures in his deck. So he's paying 4 mana to draw a card, which is a really bad rate. He was playing Symbiotic Deployment with 2 creatures in his deck, just as a way to not deck himself if he had to. If his Bow of Nylea got answered.
Oh, that is funny.
But otherwise, it's just it's a dead card. Like, it's a card he literally can't cast because it stops his draw step. So it's just a card that in his deck that is like dead air that he has to play around. So if you're making these sort of huge sacrifices to make this deck work, I think it's very interesting. I think it's very cool. I did want it to happen a little less. And so...
Right, so just to be clear about that point, the problem that you're trying to solve is not this deck was too good. The problem you're trying to solve is 3 players in a row played against this deck that didn't deliver on the promise, and they felt kind of bummed out that they didn't have the right expectations going into this draft and didn't have a good time.
Or even if they didn't, I would feel bummed out on their behalf.
Yeah.
Because, like, I'm also, to be clear, I also don't like... I think a player's emotional response to a game of Magic is a combination of a lot of factors, and some of them are your cube design decisions, a lot of them are completely outside of your control. So when I look at those things, it's more like, would I feel in their position like this promise was not delivered on, rather than how do they actually feel, which is a whole other conversation.
Right, so you want to think about the player that didn't have breakfast and then had a minor fender bender in the afternoon and is not coming to the draft in the best headspace because maybe they had a great breakfast and a nice walk, and so they're willing to tolerate a kind of rough draft. But
honestly, either end of it. Like, some people I think are way more tolerant than me, and it's not helpful for them to be like, actually, I feel fine. It's like, well, you shouldn't. That was bad. And sometimes people are just in a bad mood, and whatever goes wrong, they're going to be like, well, this sucks. I hate this. And it's like, yeah, you had a bad day. Sucks to suck. Anyway, in the case of that particular problem, the ways I solved it were...
Ban Bones, number 1.
Well, he self-banned himself. After he won that draft, he was like, I promise to never play this cube ever again. I just wanted to play once, 3-0, 6-0, design an Ornithopter, and then be done. So the first thing I did was, I think a lot of these things can be solved more by density changes than by specific card changes. Like, I think a lot of people's inclinations, if, say, Ragavan is too good, is like, well, let's put in 2 more great removal spells for Ragavan. And it's like, maybe actually you don't want 2 more great removal spells. Maybe you want 5 to 6 more medium removal spells, or a couple great ones and a couple medium ones, because that means that even if the player that has Ragavan does have the spell to back it up so that they also are playing a thing alongside it, it's still more likely that your opponents are also going to have those answers.
Yeah, that is such a good point. This came up actually in one of Scott Mertz's cubes, where he was playing both original dual lands alongside tapped dual lands, and a lot of players were kind of frustrated by that. They're like, oh, I just like happened to get the tapped lands instead of the untapped lands, and like, why is there this huge power level disparity? But if you actually looked at sort of the full sequence of the games and sort of the distribution of decks, what that meant is almost everybody could get a fetchable duel in the colors they needed.
Because you're going to wheel
those,
one.
Yeah. Yeah, we can interrogate this deeper, but like, even though some people thought it was a very weird decision and it seemed like a mistake in the cube,
they can't see the whole picture.
They didn't see the whole picture and see that, like, oh, actually, like, it's cool that for my splash color I did get this tap duel that in a pinch I can get that really like makes my mana base work.
Whereas you would not have wheeled another duel in that color.
And it is weird also that I'm saying, like, the point is we want to have players have a fun time, but some players are maybe not having as fun of a time because they were trying to put on the designer hat and being like, why is this cube not functioning the way that I expected it to? And it's like, well, just chill out. Maybe it's actually... There's too many meta layers here.
We got like 3 more podcasts worth of topics out of this discussion, but I really think that if you are just trying to, like, our goal, broadly speaking, should be to try and make an interesting game, and players show up to play interesting games, so we want players to be happy, right? Like, I think that is a good thing to sort of design for. I think fixating too much on, like, did everyone have a good time, is actually kind of not the best focus. I think it can lead you down weird roads, and it's like adhering too much to the customer is always right. It's like you end up just, making faster horses that way, I think, generally speaking.
Yeah, I think that's true, and like, you're right. This is another whole topic.
The customer is not always right. Sometimes they're a really off kid.
The customer is always right on matters of taste. because that's their own thing. Whatever. But I think you're right. This could be a whole other topic, but I think this similar thing comes up with a lot of players that are very willing to house rule things or make adjustments when somebody's like, oh, I drafted this. I thought it didn't work. Okay, we'll just say it worked the way you thought it did so you don't ruin your whole draft. And while I think that sort of solves that acute problem, it kind of erodes people's trust in another way that I think in the long run can actually be a little bit problematic. So yeah, I think you're right that we could sometimes focus on those details too much and try and answer the acute problems in the wrong way.
So anyway, I decided that density of disenchants was something I wanted to address. I think I ended up cutting 4 or 5, though not fully. I'll come back to that in a second. But I basically cut 4 or 5 cards, and my goal was, even at a table where players are disrespecting disenchants, I want it to be really hard for a player to get more than 5 or 6. Like, I just want that to be statistically very unlikely, because that is the sort of a key sort of backbone of that entire deck. Now, if you're doing a similar thing and you're pairing it with hand hate and like counter spells, like that's cooler to me. That's more interesting and more novel because their sequence and timing matters. The way the Bones built the deck, it was really just flip it all over. Look, I have more answers than you have threats. So eventually I'm just going to win, right? It was not so much about like sequencing or how you actually deploy those answers. It was just about, answer everything one by one. Counterspells or things like Duress are at least like you have to play them at the right moment. Duress is a pretty bad top deck. Like they have more texture to them. So there is more answers like that, but I think that is a different kind of removal and interaction for this deck, which I think affects it. The other thing I did, which I think is more directly impactful, is I went on a deep dive for interaction that I could replace the interaction I was cutting with that would still give me a density of removal spells, still allow you to remove the Bow of Nylea or whatever, but that this deck literally couldn't play. And the best example of this is Sheltered by Ghosts, which is an Oblivion Ring that requires that you enchant it to a creature you control. Which, if you don't control a creature, it does nothing, right? Like, Bones could not put this card in his deck no matter what, but it's another great way to get rid of any permanent that's causing you a problem that requires you to have a creature, right? It works. I even looked at cards like Deconstruction Hammer, which is a weird artifact that's quite low power. It's a common from Rivals of Ixalan, I think, that you can then turn it into like a Dispeller's Capsule and sacrifice it if it's equipped to a creature. I even looked at cards like that, but I really tried to find things that would basically just be incompatible with the problematic deck completely, rather than just like, here's the thing that answers it without thinking about the compatibility with that deck. Like, make your first lens. What are cards that this deck absolutely cannot play? This problem I'm having, what are cards that are completely incompatible with it? And then once you're looking at that set of cards, now figure out what cards can still kind of potentially address those issues you're having.
Yeah, that's such an interesting example, and I think that we could talk about other sort of very conditional removal spells, like something like a Bone Shards is a thing that's not going to fit in a control deck that doesn't have a lot of creatures, but is going to fit in another deck that is trying to, do Blood Artist stuff. So I think that could be in the right context. Another interesting example. I mean, I think the most obvious example that comes to mind, and I'm glad you thought of one that's more interesting, is like, oh, don't think of cheap removal as answer to Ragavan, because of course that's going to work alongside Ragavan, but Wrath of God. A Wrath of God is going to deal with Ragavan, and it's a card that you just do not want in the same deck.
I will say
Ragavan is so busted, sometimes maybe you do.
Well, I will say that Ragavan specifically, first of all, being a 1-drop, and then also having dash, has 2 things that are really good against 4-mana spells, but I think you're thinking the right direction.
But Sheltered by Ghosts, I think, is a cooler example of this same thing, of just coming up with a answer that just cannot make sense because it is opposed to the fundamental strategy, and will just be a literal dead card if played alongside another card.
And it's an answer you literally never arrive at if you are just taking the player's approach, because it is nowhere near the best removal you could run in this cube. Every single disenchant that's ever printed is better. You only arrive at cards like Sheltered by Ghosts after you've said, let me put aside the just run more removal, just make the cards better approach, and think about this in a holistic sense. I think the Ragavan example, though, really speaks to the density solution. Every one of these problems is going to have different solutions, right? And the best way I could describe...
And also, I feel like we should say, like, not all problems have this paradox to it. Some are easy to solve. We're talking about difficult problems.
For sure. We're talking about the hard problems here, not the easy ones that you're struggling with, listener. The Ragavan one, I think, is really solved by density, right? And you can think about that best, I think, by taking it to its extremes. Like I said, if you had 5 to 6... dinky removal spells that are maybe not that powerful, but do still answer Ragavan, like Locust Spray does the job, kills Ragavan, not the most appealing card otherwise, rather than just saying, oh, I put in, 2 more removal spells that are really good, that are like premier options that players are going to be fighting over that could potentially get played alongside Ragavan and still make it work. Just imagine a cube where you add 50 more 1-mana removal spells. Now it doesn't matter that the Ragavan player has 1 to clear blockers or 5 to clear blockers because they're never untapping against Ragavan. So That's the kind of problem where I think density is more of a solution than sort of texture, whereas the 100 Ornithopters problem was, I think, a little bit of both, but I think actually probably more texture than density. And then the last solution here kind of has two directions you can go with it, which is just accepting that the problem is a problem. And you can either accept that it's a problem and just, as we've already mentioned, make that a pillar of your format. Make that your Wasteland and Days in Legacy, because that's just what you want this cube to be. Or you could accept that it's an actual problem and just cut the problem, and not worry about trying to introduce answers to the problem. Which we should just mention, it's not particularly interesting to say, but like that is another way you can solve these things. You could just say, take the 12 best red cards and put in worse red cards, but you won't, because those 12 best red cards are probably some of your favorite cards to play. They're in the regular cube because you love them, so this is more of a, accept that that's the nature of this cube, and make it part of the expectation setting, make it part of the meta, let the sort of thing self-correct. Whereas the sort of deck I'm describing, 100 Ornithopters, I thought, I'm not going to let this sort of just like self-correct, because I kind of feel like it might self-correct to a place where this is one of the best decks that shows up every other draft, and that is not what I want.
Right. Yeah, I mean, something else that's sort of related to that in the regular cube specifically, and unfortunately this doesn't apply to a lot of people, is I'm playing in this very middle power level where there are lots of cards that are better than the cards that I'm playing. So the easiest solution that I've done to solve, red is still the best color right now, but we've had similar issues in the past.
Probably. It's funny, I think red is like the best color, but I think blue-white is the best color combination. Tricky.
That's definitely possible. But I had the luxury in this cube, because I'm playing at this sort of medium power level, to just power up other stuff and say like, okay, well, let's make green aggressive decks more effective. Let's make black sacrifice more powerful. And
the two best things to pair with red.
Sure, great. Put them with red. I don't care. But the point being, like, there was a lot of flexibility to, instead of trying to come up with a particular like balancing or a particular counterpoint to directly answer things, I could just adjust the balance upward of other strategies to depower it against the whole field, which I think is just one of the best reasons to design cubes at a lower power level. It just gives you so much more flexibility as a designer to be able to not just tune things down, but also tune other things up. That I think that if you're interested in getting into the weeds of cube design, I would definitely encourage you to do that rather than just taking that power-motivated mindset and just trying to play the strongest cards you can.
Yeah. I agree that is a huge benefit of playing at a lower power level. It's also a huge benefit of playing in this sort of novel space, right? Like, 100 Ornithopters is not low power. I am mostly playing the most powerful cards that make sense with that restriction, because I think that's part of the fun of the novelty there. But because it is so novel, it also means that there are 100 really powerful Disenchants, which means I get to choose from among them, and Sheltered by Ghosts is still good enough. It's still very, very playable here. You still want it in your deck because all the Disenchants are so good. So you're very happy to play Sheltered by Ghosts, even though it is certainly not within the top 20 or even 50 most powerful options. It's still good enough because of this weird novel restriction. One last thing we didn't really talk about is that I think a lot of these, you have a problem and you add a solution and now they just get played alongside each other, are when you're talking about two monocolored cards, because I think the expectation in almost every cube is you're going to be two colors at least. Like, it's, this monocolored decks do exist, but I think the baseline for most cubes on average is you're playing at least two colors, which means that it's trivial to play your Orcish Bowmasters alongside your Delver of Secrets or whatever. Whereas if you add a gold card in two off colors from your problem, you're now asking the player that wants to do the thing you don't want them to do, to play the solution alongside the problem, to reach a lot further, to try and actually play Abrupt Decay alongside the new Broken Ajani or Ocelot Pride or something. I'm trying to think of powerful cards in non-black-green color combinations. So that is another option, I think. And we've talked a lot on this show about how to use your sort of gold card design space, and I think there's still so much ink to be spilled on that, because that's one of the ways I think you can use gold slots that people don't talk about a lot, is like, just make this a like narrow kind of answer that the gold deck is actually going to wheel. Like, a lot of people don't like the idea that gold cards will wheel to the player that has them because they just get them for free. I love that. I love when I know that I can expect No More Lies to end up in the deck of the blue-white control player, even if they didn't take it aggressively, because they're going to wheel it, because that just means that I can introduce a tool that player is very likely to get. I want that player to have access to some exile counterspells, and by adding No More Lies instead of some hypothetical No More Lies that's much more appealing that is going to be fought over, it means that I can more guarantee it ends up in their pool, which is a cool design tool.
Yeah, it's such a different way of thinking about gold cards and their role that I think makes a lot of sense.
So that's the cube designer's paradox, at least as I've been calling it. It's obviously it's a game design paradox, but the specific examples we talked about come up in cube design all the time, and I think if you are aware of it, you'll see it in your own cubes more often, you'll see it in other cubes you're talking about, of just hyperfixation on a specific problem, in big air quotes, a thing you want to change, is usually not the best way to solve that problem. You usually have to think in a much broader sense about the whole meta, the whole system of the cube, rather than just think, here's this pinpoint thing I want to address. Let's find pinpoint solutions to it. That's just not how this works. It's like you're trying to then put a pinpoint into a spider web, and then the spider web, breaks a couple strands, and the shape changes completely, and it's not a very good metaphor.
Yeah, I think we can do better than that.
Okay, take it away.
What exactly was your spider web?
I'm just trying to think of a system and then a pinpoint, and metaphors are hard. If you have a better metaphor for that, please write in or sound off in the comments. Anthony, I think I added 4 new cube events to the website this past week. Some of them have been brewing for a while. They've been in the fermentation fridge for a while, but they finally have dates. So as of right now, we have at least 2 cube events every month through October, through the rest of the year. So if you want to attend a local cube event, check out our website, luckypaper.co/events, and find the event nearest to you and go attend it. It is the best Magic event Anthony and I have ever attended of these small grassroots cube events. We just cannot recommend them highly enough. So check them out and go play some cube, the best format, with some people in a city near you.
Yeah, we've heard some feedback from some people that, yeah, that's great if you're in the Northeast corridor, but actually a bunch more are popping up on the West Coast and around the country. So at least if you're in the US and a couple more in Germany, it's becoming more of a thing and it's spreading, just like mold across an inoculated bed of rice.
Yes. I'm sorry to say that they do basically follow the trends of where the highest population centers are.
Yeah, that's actually a good way to think about it.
That's just how it's going to be. But
they're more.
That means they're usually going to be in places that are cheaper to fly to because they're in...
Yeah.
But there's always more coming, and I'm aware of many others that are in the fermentation chamber that are not ready to announce publicly yet, so stay tuned to that page.
And hopefully we'll see you at some of these events. I'm excited for the next ones we're going to be at shortly.
Yeah, my summer is packed up with cube travel.
Same.
Which is a good thing, but also a thing that deserves some scrutiny at some point, because my vacation this year is basically one little family vacation for a week, and then a bunch of cube events, which is probably good. I think it's good.
So what's your point? You got to get your family into cube so you can get the
exactly.
sweep?
I got to eliminate that one non-cube vacation, so it's all cube vacations all the way down.
Problem solved.
But on that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. If we got any of the card text or rules or anything wrong about the Legacy metagame in this episode, that was completely intentional. We know the right thing. We just said the wrong thing so that you can leave a comment correcting us, and that will boost all of our engagement.
If you already left a comment that says, actually, Emrakul has protection from spells that are 1 or more colors, so it can't be unsummoned, we baited you.
But do comment about your better metaphors. We do need those.
Oh yeah, do comment. That's the point. You're supposed to comment. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and speaking into microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube and for the future gift of fermented foods.
Thank you for the gift of helping me. I mean, sincerely, that was a huge help.
I feel like I was just there for emotional support. It was just like,
no, you just did all the work. You were like,
but you could have done it too. I feel like you just needed
you could have done it, but I would emotionally support you by just doing it for you. That is exactly what you did, and that's perfect.
Yeah, this is the thing. I feel like I'm in that position a lot, where it's like I just need I need the activation energy to just do this thing that has been floating around, and what will give me the activation energy is somebody some accountability. Like, it's on the counter now. We're gonna do it this time. It's just gonna happen,
Yeah. Accountability. I feel like I've been feeling that a lot with just sort of people are looking for that, and they're just like, I just need to start a book club or a meetup group where I just do this thing and just have other people around to do it, and I support that. I am also very much looking for that kind of community, and I'm so looking forward to being able to make some miso for you.
I can't wait.
Should be good.